You wake to the sound of hooves pounding against the dirt. The Lord Steward has arrived. Your rent is due, your grain sacks are half empty, and you already know you don't have enough to pay. What will they take instead? Your last chicken? Your only cow? Or will they take something far worse? When hunger drives your child to steal, when war takes your husband, how are you going to protect your family? Childbirth in medieval times was not a moment of joy, but a test of survival. For both mother and child, the dangers were immense. There were no doctors, no sterile tools, and no understanding of infection. Instead, there was only a midwife, a handful of herbal remedies, and prayers. A peasant woman gave birth at home, often in the same straw-filled hut where she slept, cooked, and raised her other children. If she was lucky, an experienced midwife from the village would be there to assist. If not, she relied on the women of her family. There was no pain relief, and there was no safe way to intervene if something went wrong. If the baby struggled to come out, or if the mother bled too much, there was little anyone could do. For every child born, there was a chance that one or both would not survive. Once the baby arrived, the midwife quickly examined it. A strong cry was a good sign, but a quiet, unmoving newborn meant trouble. Some were born too small and too weak, their tiny bodies already cold before they could take their first breath. Others came into the world struggling for air, while their mothers whispered desperate prayers as the midwife rubbed their chests, hoping to bring them to life. A child that survived birth faced a world full of dangers. Half of all children died before their 5th birthday, with many lost in their first year of life. Illnesses that are mild today, such as fevers, coughs, and stomach sickness, could be fatal. There were no treatments beyond herbs, and there was no real understanding of disease. If a baby grew weak, the family could do little but watch. Some recovered, but many did not. For this reason, parents hesitated to grow attached too quickly. A mother who had lost one or more children before might keep her emotions guarded, knowing that love could make loss unbearable. Some families delayed naming their child, waiting to see if they would survive, while others gave newborns the names of deceased siblings, as if to grant them a second chance at life. The first months were a time of constant worry. A baby's first winter was the hardest, with the cold, damp air and long, dark months posing a serious threat. Families wrapped their infants in whatever scraps of wool or linen they had, keeping them close by the fire, but warmth was no guarantee of safety. Infections spread quickly in the cramped, smoky huts where multiple family members lived in close quarters. Those who survived their first year had a better chance, but they were never truly safe. Every illness, every harsh winter, and every period of hunger was a test. For medieval parents, every day they had with their child was a gift, but nothing was ever certain. And so, they hoped, they endured, and they prayed that their child would live to see another day. Yet the question remained, how much longer could they hold on? For a medieval peasant family, food was never guaranteed. A good harvest meant survival, but a bad one meant hunger, and hunger could mean death. Morning began with the same dull ache, a hollow feeling in the stomach that never fully went away. The mother rose early, moving carefully in the dim light of the hut. The fire had burned low overnight, its warmth fading into the cold morning air. She stirred the embers and reached for the sack of grain in the corner. It was lighter than it should be. She untied the cloth and reached inside, her fingers brushing the bottom. There was just enough for a single meal. Breakfast was simple, the same as yesterday and the same as tomorrow. A pot of pottage made by boiling grains in water was all they had. If she was lucky, there might be a scrap of onion or a handful of beans to add for flavor. If she had nothing, she would stretch the meal as far as she could. She ladled out portions carefully, making sure each child received their share. The youngest ate first, his small hands gripping the wooden bowl. The older children knew better than to ask for more. They had learned, in the hardest way possible, that food was something to be measured, not expected. For a peasant, there was no variety in diet. Bread, pottage, and ale were the staples of every meal. Meat was rare, eaten only on special occasions or when a village animal died. Milk, eggs, and cheese were sometimes available, but only if the Lord's taxes left them with anything to spare. Even now, with a poor harvest behind them, they owed more than they could give. She had seen what happened to families who ran out of food. Last winter, a neighboring family had tried to survive on boiled bark and scraps of dried leaves. Their youngest child had wasted away first, and the others had followed soon after. The mother had been found by the road, holding the last of her children in her arms, rocking them as if they were only sleeping. The peasant woman did not want to think about it, but she knew the choices ahead would not be easy. Some families sent their older children away to work in wealthier households, not for wages, but for survival. Fewer mouths to feed meant a better chance for the youngest. Sometimes those children never returned. When famine struck, there were no options. A mother would go hungry so her children could eat. A father would tighten his belt and pretend he was not starving. And when there was nothing left, they would go to the monastery, begging for food, hoping the monks had enough to spare. The morning meal was finished, and the pot was scraped clean. By midday, the children would be hungry again, but there would be no more until evening. The mother sat by the fire, listening to the wind outside and feeling the gnawing ache in her stomach. Hunger was a part of life, but even hunger was not the greatest burden they carried. A medieval peasant did not own the land they worked. They lived by the Lord's mercy, farming his fields, tending his animals, and giving him a share of everything they produced. No matter how much they toiled, the best of their harvest was never theirs to keep. The Lord's steward would come soon. He always did. His arrival was never a surprise, only a moment of dread. For them, taxes were a constant weight, pressing down with every passing season. A portion of every harvest, every loaf of bread, and every bushel of grain belonged to the Lord. What remained was barely enough to feed the family through winter. But the demands did not end there. The church took its tithe, a tenth of everything, given as an offering to God. Some priests were kind, allowing struggling families to give less in times of hardship. Others were not. To refuse the tithe was to risk the wrath of both the church and the community. Even in hunger, a peasant family paid. Then there was the corvée, the unpaid labor owed to the Lord. Several days each week, a peasant man worked not for himself, but for the manor. He plowed the Lord's fields, repaired the Lord's roads, and built the Lord's fences. A woman might be called to work in the manor kitchens, weaving, sewing, or spinning wool. They had no choice. To refuse was to risk eviction. And yet, even with all they gave, it was never enough. If a family fell behind on their dues, the steward would take what he could. A chicken, a goat, or a sack of grain meant to last the winter would be taken without hesitation. The mother had seen it happen before. Families reduced to nothing, forced from their homes, left to beg for shelter in another village. But no matter how desperate the times, theft was a risk few would dare take. The law made sure of that. Medieval justice was swift and merciless. If a child was accused of stealing, there was no pleading their case and no second chances. The village would gather and the trial would begin. Trial by ordeal was the law. The accused would be made to hold a red-hot iron bar, their bare hands wrapped around the glowing metal. If the burn healed cleanly in the days that followed, God had deemed them innocent. If it festered, they were guilty. Guilt meant punishment. Sometimes it was a severed hand. Other times it was a public whipping. A thief might be branded, marked forever as a criminal. And for some, the sentence was death. It did not matter if the child had stolen or not. The judgment was left to fire, to faith, and to fate. For many, the moment their skin touched the burning metal, their fate had already been sealed. The mother wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. She glanced at the grain sacks one last time. It would not be enough. It was never enough, and when war arrived, it took more than just food. War was a distant concern for nobles and lords. It was a game of power, land, and titles. However, for peasants, war was something else entirely. It meant fire in the fields, men taken from their homes, and villages left in ruin. The mother had seen it before. She had heard the distant horns, the pounding of hooves, and the screams of women and children. War did not ask who was innocent, nor did it spare those who had nothing to do with it. It arrived without warning and left nothing but silence in its wake. The greatest fear was conscription. A lord at war needed men, and peasants had no right to refuse. The father of the family could be called away at any time, handed a dull sword or a wooden shield, and told to fight for a cause he barely understood. There was no training and no preparation. A farmer today could become a soldier tomorrow, and if he died, there would be no compensation and no mercy. His family would be left to fend for themselves. Some never returned. Others came back broken, scarred, and maimed. Some bore wounds that never fully healed, while others carried injuries no one could see. A missing arm or a deep wound left untreated could keep a man from working, but the ones who returned with hollow eyes and haunted minds were often just as lost as the ones who never came home. A father lost to war, whether in body or spirit, was as good as a death sentence for the family he left behind. Yet, war did not only take men, it took homes. A village caught in the path of an army had no chance. Soldiers raided homes, slaughtered livestock, and took what little grain had been stored for the winter. They left behind smoldering ruins and hollow-eyed survivors, clutching starving children with nowhere left to go. For peasant families, there was no defense. There were no walls to hide behind and no weapons to fight back. Some ran while others begged for mercy. Many hid their children, praying the soldiers would pass them by. But war had no rules. If the wrong army found them, children could be taken, forced into servitude, or marched off as plunder with their fate unknown. Some would never see their families again. In this era, war was never far away, and when it came, there would be no stopping it. But war was not the only thing that stole their childhood. For a peasant child, childhood did not exist in the way it does today. There was no time for carefree play, no years of schooling, and no gradual shift into adulthood. From the moment they could walk, they had a role to fill. At 5 years old, a boy followed his father into the fields. He was too small to hold a plow and too weak to carry heavy loads, but that did not matter. He pulled weeds with his bare hands, gathered firewood, and led the oxen by rope. His feet were covered in mud, and his hands were blistered from work. He learned quickly that complaints were useless, because the fields did not care if he was tired. His sister, only a year older, stayed by their mother's side. She carried water from the well, balancing heavy clay jugs against her hip. She learned to grind grain and stir pottage over an open fire. By the time she was 7, she would be trusted to care for younger siblings, mend clothes, and keep the household running when her mother was away. There was no choice in the matter. A child who could not work was a burden, and burdens did not survive. By the time a boy reached 10, he was expected to labor from sunrise to sunset. He worked beside his father, breaking the soil, planting crops, and gathering the harvest that would never truly belong to them. His body ached, his back bent under the weight of sacks filled with grain, and his mind never wandered beyond the land. A girl of 12 was not a child but a woman in the eyes of the village. Many were already promised in marriage, their futures decided by fathers and landowners. Some would bear children before they had even reached 15. If their husbands were kind, they might have a moment of happiness. If they were not, they would endure because endurance was all they knew. There was no school for peasant children. Letters and numbers were for priests and noblemen, not for those who spent their days in the dirt. The only education they received was survival. They learned how to tend a field, how to spin wool, and how to make bread stretch for an extra day. Even in hardship, there were moments of childhood. They were small and fleeting, but they existed. A stolen hour of play after the day's work was done, a doll made of straw passed between sisters, or a wooden hoop rolled along the ground with laughter ringing through the fields. But these moments never lasted long. By the time a child reached 14, they were indistinguishable from their parents. The boys were men, the girls were wives. There was no celebration and no milestone to mark the transition. One day, they were children, and the next, they were not. And so, the cycle continued. Children grew up to become parents, raising their own in the only way they knew. They taught them not to dream, not to hope, but only to work. In this world, work was survival. And yet, even the hardest work could not guarantee survival. When effort was not enough, all that remained was faith. In a world where disease, famine, and war could take a child without warning, faith was the only source of comfort. Religion did not just guide their beliefs, it dictated how they raised their children. The church played a central role in their lives from the very beginning. A child's fate was placed in God's hands the moment they were born. Baptism was never delayed because an infant who died unbaptized was believed to be lost forever, trapped in limbo. Priests were often called to the bedside of sickly newborns, sometimes performing the rite over a child too weak to open their eyes. Some babies died in their mother's arms before the final words of the prayer could be spoken. Every Sunday, families gathered in the village church, kneeling on cold stone floors and listening to sermons that warned of sin and damnation. Obedience was considered sacred. A child who disobeyed their parents was disobeying God himself. A lazy child, a disrespectful child, or one who did not fear authority was seen as a danger not just to the family but to their own soul. But religion alone was not always enough to quiet a mother's fears. When sickness came, when fevers worsened, and when prayers went unanswered, she turned to something older than the church. She relied on whispered traditions, passed down through generations, in hopes that they might succeed where faith had failed. She tied a small pouch of herbs around her child's neck. They believed it would ward off the evil spirits that carried disease. She hung a carved wooden cross above the bed, with the hope that it would keep death from creeping through the door. If the sickness lingered, she sought out the village healer, an old woman who knew which roots to boil and which leaves to press against burning skin. Some believed illness was not a punishment from God, but a curse. It could be cast by a jealous neighbor, a wandering stranger, or a woman suspected of witchcraft. In times of desperation, parents sought protection through charms, burned certain plants to drive away spirits, or whispered incantations alongside their prayers. But faith could be dangerous too. A mother whose child had died might be told that it was because of her sins, that she had not prayed hard enough, had not been devout enough. A father struggling to feed his family might wonder if he was being punished for past mistakes. A village devastated by famine might blame a widow, a healer, a woman who had always been a little different. And when tragedy struck, when a child was lost, despite all prayers, all charms, all desperate pleas, there was no answer, only silence. Faith was everything, and yet it was not always enough. And so, peasant parents did what they had always done. They prayed, they feared, and they did their best to keep their children safe in a world where safety did not exist. Love in the medieval world was not spoken, nor was it soft or gentle. It was sacrifice. It was endurance. A mother went hungry so her child could eat. A father worked himself to exhaustion, knowing his labor would never be enough. Parents did not dream of better futures for their children, because dreams did not fill empty stomachs. They only prayed their sons and daughters would survive. There were no embraces and no gentle words. Love was a carved wooden toy left by the fire. A lullaby hummed softly at the end of a long day. or a hand resting briefly on a child's shoulder before sending them back to work. A peasant parent had no power to change the world their children lived in. They could not promise safety, nor could they shield them from the cruel realities of hunger, disease, and war. But they could prepare them for it. They raised them to be strong, to endure. Because in this life, love alone would not keep them alive.